Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy blasted President Biden and the other NATO leaders for failing to extend membership to his country, tweeting, quote, "We received signals that certain wording is being discussed without Ukraine, but would like to emphasize that this word fixing is about the invitation to become NATO members, not about Ukraine's membership."
Zelenskyy called the leaders' reluctance absurd, adding that it would prompt Russia to continue its, quote, terror. Here's what President Biden said after that decision in a meeting with Zelenskyy.
So, thank you for what you're doing, and the bad news for you is we're not going anywhere. You're stuck with us. So thank you.
Here to discuss the latest developments from the NATO summit is Dov Zakheim, former Undersecretary of Defense. Welcome, Dov.
Thank you.
All right. So what do you make of both Zelensky's comments that precluding Ukraine from joining NATO at this time definitively, the way that Joe Biden seems to have done, is enabling Russia to continue its, quote, terror against Ukraine?
Well, you could understand why Zelensky's frustrated. He's always pushed for as much as he can get. He actually backed off from that statement since he made it, because he said that he doesn't want to start a nuclear war by pushing things too quickly in terms of NATO membership. He has a reason to be skeptical. First of all, some of the things that have been promised are just that, promises. Secondly, there's going to be a new NATO-Ukraine Council. But he no doubt knows that there was once a NATO-Russia Council, and we know how that one's fallen apart. So he's frustrated. He's been given some pretty good guarantees. He's been told that he's on an express train to membership, but that he simply will not be able to lead his country into NATO until the war is over, which frankly is pretty reasonable.
Right. And, Biden spoke the other day about, obviously, if Ukraine were admitted in the midst of the war, this would put us in ostensibly rather than just indirect, but direct confrontation with Russia, with the nuclear power. And that's, something the U.S. has to obviously avoid. What do you make of the current progress of the war? Obviously, the Biden administration has committed to, continuing to fund Zelenskyy, Ukraine for as long as it takes. The phrase "for as long as it takes" has come up a lot, and this is something that has dragged on for a while now. There are concerns about with troop levels in Ukraine over the fullness of time. Obviously, Russia has a lot more bodies that can throw this conflict. Where do you see this headed right now?
Well, the Ukrainians are still trying to find a weak spot in the Russian defenses so that they could break through. Basically, you need about a 5-to-1 advantage in order to really break through a defensive line, and they're not there yet. So that's number one. Number two is Mr. Putin clearly is waiting to see what happens in the 2024 elections. He can certainly hold out until then. Remember that the Russians aren't as isolated as people think. They've got the global South, so-called, behind them, doing business with India, doing business with China, doing business with Brazil, and many others. And so he could hold out until the elections. In fact, he could hold out until he gets up for elections in March of 24, and then the November 24 elections of ours. So this is going to go on for a while. And you got to remember that if a NATO member is attacked, then NATO is committed. Now, it's not as fully committed as people think. The parliaments have to approve this. But generally speaking, people think that if a NATO member is attacked, parliaments are going to approve going to war on its behalf. That is not what we want to do. That's not what the Europeans want to do. They're certainly ready to help, and we are helping the Ukrainians, but they're fighting for themselves and not having others doing the work for them. The Ukrainians don't even want that. They haven't ever said we want American troops in or German troops in or whatever. So I think, as I say, Mr. Biden made the right call on this one, as did NATO.
Well, if it's not about wanting American troops or German troops or any other NATO ally troops in, to what do you attribute Ukraine's interest in joining NATO at this time. And I just want to also point out that the critique that many anti-war advocates have made is that there was, NATO is supposed to be this post-Cold War commitment, a defensive treaty that was not supposed to move 1 inch eastward. Obviously, it's expanded repeatedly since that time, and that expansion is, by some arguments, part of the provocation of Putin to invade Ukraine in the first instance. Not that that makes it legitimate or legal in the least, but that's part of the story as to how this conflict started. What do then the ongoing conversations about Ukraine joining NATO do to help bring the conflict to a close?
Well, I think the feeling in NATO and in the White House is that they don't help bring the conflict to a close. They could make it worse. What you've been saying is pretty much, not that you're echoing Putin, but that's what Putin's been saying, that it's all the West's fault, really, that if we hadn't expanded, if we hadn't moved troops into Poland, or which we started to do, none of this would have happened. The only problem is it doesn't explain why he seized Crimea. It doesn't explain why he sent troops into eastern Ukraine. It doesn't explain why he attacked Georgia, for example. In 2008, Mr. Putin wants to reinstate the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Empire, the empire of Peter the Great. And he sees Ukraine as part of Russia. The reason they don't call it a war, they call it a special military operation, is because as far as they're concerned, they are fighting essentially a civil war, no different from their war with Chechnya. The fact that Ukraine is an independent country, recognized by everybody as such, doesn't seem to bother Mr. Putin in the least.
Mr. Zelenskyy, you mentioned Crimea as evidence that Putin has these broader territorial goals. But if that's the case, then why America's choice not to become engaged militarily when that annexation happened during the Obama administration? Why the change of heart now? What demands American involvement, even if you agree that Putin's actions are illegal and wrong?
Well, frankly, I think we probably should have responded more forcefully when Russia marched into Crimea. But we did ramp up our support for Ukraine. I mean, part of the reason they're doing so well is we've been training them since the occupation of Crimea. And it's clear that unlike Crimea, which has a funny kind of history because it really was part of Russia, and then Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the leader of the Soviet Union and came from Ukraine, decided that Crimea should be part of Ukraine. So it's a much more complex issue. The rest of the occupation of Ukraine is not complex at all.
Can the same
the
not
Russians
be said?
have invaded an independent country.
Can the arguments about ethnic Russians and the Russian language and the kind of affinity of the people toward Russia in the eastern occupied regions of Ukraine, can the same argument about that kind of natural affinity between those groups and Russia not be made as the argument that you made about Crimea having the special relationship with Russia?
Well, first of all, eastern Ukraine was never shifted over to Ukraine from Russia in the first place. That's one difference with Crimea. The second difference is if you look at the behavior of people in the eastern part of Ukraine, since the war, since the invasion, the number of people who have identified themselves as Ukrainians, in spite of their being Russian speakers, in spite of whatever connections they have with Russia, has really skyrocketed. It's clear that not everybody in eastern Ukraine was happy with what happened before. And so it's a part of the country. By the way, most of Eastern Europe, and not just Eastern Europe, all these countries have minorities. Once you start invading other countries to so-called liberate minorities, there's no end to it. Remember, in 1938, Hitler marched into Czechoslovakia because he claimed that the Sudeten Germans wanted to be part of Germany. And we saw where that led to.
Dov Zakheim, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.